Special Envoy for Global Education. Before we get to the spokesperson briefing, we'll start with former Prime Minister Brown, who will be here to talk about the need for safe schools.
Yeah, it's been 1 month since the kidnapping of 89 South Sudanese boys from their classrooms in a school in South Sudan to be trained as child soldiers. It's 3 months since the Peshawar attack in Pakistan, which killed 140 children. It's just almost a year since Boko Haram kidnapped more than 200 girls from their school in Chibok in the Borno state of Nigeria. And it's now almost exactly 4 years since the beginning of a conflict in Syria, which has left 1 million children as child refugees outside Syria and another 1 million displaced within Syria, most of whom are no longer in education. And I've come here this morning because it is time for the international community to wake up to this violation of the rights of children. Terror attacks on schools are at the highest level they have been for 40 years. There have been more than 10,000 attacks on schools during the past 5 years alone. 28 million girls and boys are not in schools in areas of conflict or emergency. And there is even now still very little clarity about the guidelines that would ensure schools have the same protection as hospitals do under the Geneva Conventions. Worse than that, perhaps, only 1% of humanitarian aid is going to education to help children, the millions who are caught in the midst of conflicts. And therefore, I want to emphasize today that it's time to end the shameful breaches of international law that are violating the rights of millions of children. It's time for this year, 2015, to be the year for ending the violation of the rights of children. It's time to stop the now growing tactic of abducting children from their schools and using them as weapons of war. And it's time to insist that even in conflict zones, there are properly resourced safe schools that enable children to enjoy their education in peace. Now, in the last few years, I've visited all the countries that I'm talking about: Pakistan, Nigeria, the DRC, South Sudan. I will soon visit Lebanon and see how children have become the silent and tragic victims of conflict and their rights neglected. As world-renowned author J.K. Rowling said only recently, who is easier to silence than a child? There are 4 actions that I'm proposing, all of which can be agreed and put into place this year if the world community wakes up to this challenge. First of all, I think it's important to reach an agreement on a global fund for education in emergencies, a humanitarian fund that would be there to help whenever there was a situation where education was interrupted, where schools were being closed through lack of funds because of humanitarian disasters, whether conflicts or other emergencies. And we're setting a deadline for progress to get agreement on such a fund by the Oslo Summit on Global Education that's to be held under the auspices of the Norwegian government in July. Secondly, we need to have particular attention this year to the needs of the Syrian refugees, hundreds of thousands whom are denied education unnecessarily as refugees in other countries or as displaced in their own countries. We have an agreement with the Lebanese government that they will operate a double shift system for children so that Lebanese children would be educated in the morning in the same school, that in the afternoon Syrian refugees would also have the chance of education. So there is no need to build new schools. What we need is the money that allows the teachers who are available, the schools that are accessible, and the government that is willing to fund the education of nearly 500,000 children who are out of school in Lebanon today. That requires 163 million. It's a very cheap, cost-effective way of doing it without having to build new schools. And we have called a conference on April the 16th in Washington, chaired by the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Borge Brende, and it is our aim to raise the 163 million necessary to ensure that there are safe schools in Lebanon for Syrian refugees. Then today also, following the successful piloting of a Safe Schools initiative in Nigeria, thanks to the work of President Goodluck Jonathan, we are now announcing a Safe Schools initiative in Pakistan, following Peshawar, a private-public partnership which will enable us to pilot in 1,000 schools new technology that will enable schools to be made safer and we will shortly announce plans to extend that to South Sudan, to Lebanon, to the DRC, and to other countries. And we have here today two brilliant business leaders, Predictify Me, a new company in the United States, Rob Burns and Yeshwan, who has developed this new technology that can advise schools, governments, local authorities of the threat to their schools, of the technology and the changes that are needed to protect the school, of the risks and the likelihood of a terrorist attack on the schools. And this has been welcomed by the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Mr. Sharif, who has issued a statement today in support of this new initiative. This new technology enables schools to be far safer. They can be better fortified. Communications between them and police and other authorities can be better. The risks of a terrorist attack can be assessed. And given that there are terrorist attacks on schools so regularly, it is an important element in the war to make sure that schools are safer in the future. And as I said, Predictify Me are here with us today, and they're prepared to show you, if there is any interest from any newspaper or any media outlet here, just how this new technology can work. He has predicted correctly, this company has predicted correctly potential terrorist attacks, and of course they can advise on how to make schools safer. And as you will see in the press release, Prime Minister Sharif has issued a statement supporting this and saying that he will be at the forefront of international efforts to counter this form of terrorism. The final point I want to make is the International Safe Schools Declaration, what has often been called the Lucerne Guidelines, to protect schools from militarization and from attacks, giving schools the same protection as the Red Cross, has been supported by 30 countries, and we need now the rest of the world to say that they will not only support, but they will honour these guidelines that will be a major protection for children who used to think that going to school allowed them to be part of a safe haven, and now many are coming to realise that their schools have become weapons and instruments of war. I look forward to this year's Security Council report on children in armed conflict. The Special Representative is doing a brilliant job, and she's giving special attention to South Sudan. On April the 1st, the Human Rights Council will hold a special meeting on Boko Haram, and I've talked to the Human Rights Commissioner, who will report also on the threat to children's rights as a result of the violations of education in their schools and in their communities. We can no longer wait as a world and ignore the fact that violations against children in their own schools and as school children have risen in the last few years. We have neglected this issue at our peril, and many children have lost their lives as a result. We must now build more innovative partnerships that will involve technology companies, business, foundations and government to deliver on this Safe Schools initiative. We should not forget that today there are 28 million children who are denied even the most basic chance of a right to education in some of the most troubled and poorest countries of the world. And it is our duty, not just because there are international laws to protect children against violence, but it is our moral duty to make sure that every single child in the world can enjoy the basic right to education, free of terror, free of fear, and with the support of the international community. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. And if you can all identify yourselves and speak into the microphones. Ali?
Thank you. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, you're welcome, sir.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
My name is Ali Barada. I work for France 24 TV, and I work also for An-Nahar newspaper in Lebanon. So my question to you, do you think that there is a need for the international community to do something here through the Security Council ahead of Oslo International Conference to reach the goals and the objectives that you're talking about? And also, can you please tell us what are you going to do exactly in Lebanon? Thank you.
Yeah, the usual explanation about why children are either denied healthcare or shelter or education is that there is not the capacity within the system to deliver, that you're dealing with an emergency and you cannot act quickly enough. Here in Lebanon, we've got a unique agreement with the government of Lebanon to provide school places for 500,000 children. The teachers are available. The schools are available, operating a second shift system. What is missing is the international community's commitment to the money that will finance this initiative. So no longer can people say it is impossible for this to happen. It takes too long to build facilities like schools or camps. The facilities are there, the teachers are there, the government is supportive. The question is, will the international community provide the money that's necessary? And this is $500 at most a year to educate a child in Lebanon as a Syrian refugee, and we still are unable, having raised 100 million from countries that are willing to support this, to find the next $163 million a year to undertake this initiative. So I'm appealing to countries around the world to support an initiative which for a limited amount of money could get these children into school tomorrow. And so that is the difference. And the importance of education in a conflict, I think we've got to recognize this, is it is important always that there is food and that there is shelter and that there is healthcare provided. Without that, people will not survive. But if we're talking about the future, then it is education that gives children hope. It's the possibility that there's a future worth planning for. It's the possibility there's a return to normalcy that is possible. And this is why I think education is such an important part of humanitarian aid. We must give these children and young people the hope that they will have at least some years of their life growing up in a school and not be condemned to be out of schools forever. So my plea is that the international community provide the funds that are necessary. The funding conference has been called for Washington, that I'm going to be part of organizing next month. This is money that, if made available now, could make an immediate difference tomorrow.
Okay, Iftikhar?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Farhan. I'm Iftikhar Ali from Associated Press of Pakistan. So your guidelines are excellent, but the problem is always implementation of these guidelines. Will you be setting up a mechanism in your office to monitor whether these things are being done?
Yeah, I've talked to Prime Minister Sharif. I've visited Pakistan. I've looked at what needs to be done, and clearly Pakistan is the country with the second largest number of children who are out of education. If Nigeria has more than 10 million children not in education, Pakistan has anything between 5 and 7 million children who today are not getting education. And of course, girls are most discriminated against in their ability to get access to education. So we are working with the government and working with the different states within Pakistan, the provinces, to try to get a plan for each of these provinces to get every child to school. But clearly, after Peshawar, the issue of violence against children, the threats to children deter many from going to school, and that's why it's necessary to think of safe schools. Safe schools pioneered in Nigeria, necessary in Pakistan, the support now of Mr. Sharif's government to do so, but new technology available now to make this happen. And that's why when you say, are you going to monitor the implementation? The people who are here today in Predictify can actually monitor exactly what is happening in individual schools in Pakistan and potentially every school in Pakistan over a period of time. And their offer, which is a philanthropic offer for which I thank them, from someone who is one of the directors of the company, who himself is one of 14 children brought up in Pakistan and the only one that was given the chance of education, and then managed to get a Fulbright scholarship and an Eisenhower scholarship in the United States of America. They've developed this new technology, which is able to monitor on a day-to-day basis what is happening in individual schools. So we have now a means by which we can hold the government and the schools accountable for whether they are fortifying the schools, whether they're making the schools safer, and whether, of course, they are monitoring the possibilities of terrorist attacks. So this is a major step forward, and this new technology, I hope, will be made available to other countries around the world, South Sudan, DRC, where there is also the threat of violence in schools.
Michelle?
Thanks, Farhan. Thanks for the briefing. Michelle Nichols from Reuters. When you talk about making these schools safer and less vulnerable to attacks, how much have you looked to what's been done here in the United States to make schools safer from various sorts of attacks and what might be transferable to elsewhere in the world? And could you, when you talk about this company being able to monitor these schools, are we talking like video cameras and stuff? I'm not sure if you can elaborate a little bit on the technology.
Yeah, I think Predictify Me, who are here, would be willing to give a presentation to anybody who's interested in seeing what can happen. The tragic attacks in schools in America, which shocked not only America but the whole of the world, are so terrible because they are so rare in a country like America. The problem in countries that we're talking about is attacks on schools are all too common. And therefore, we have to learn from what's been done to protect schools in the United States, but recognize that we've also got to do something about the fear that exists in many countries that your school will be the next school that is under attack, and the rising prevalence of violence in attacks against children over recent years. And that's why we need basic precautions for safety in schools. That's why we need regular monitoring of what's actually happening. And that's why we need to show the parents and the pupils of schools in these countries that we are doing everything in our power. Of course, a dedicated terrorist group, it is difficult to stop them if they've highlighted one particular school that they're going to bomb or attack. But what we can do is reduce the fear that exists in countries like Nigeria and Pakistan, Afghanistan and Iraq now, Syria, that your school is going to be the next school to be attacked, by giving people the confidence that we're doing everything in our power to make that school protected. The technology now exists to have a far greater capacity to monitor what's going on, and I'm sure that our friends would be prepared to show it to you.
George?
Thank you. George Baumgarten, correspondent for Jewish newspapers in North America and for some East African newspapers. I want to make sure I understand this correctly. Am I correct in my understanding that the school-age population in Syria, or the better part of it, have lost, according to my calculations, I may be a little off, the better part of 4.5 academic years, and the children in some of the West African and Northeast African countries have lost somewhat lesser amounts? And what is being done about that? What is being done to inform people of this? And is there not some kind of worldwide advertising campaign to bring the consciousness of the world to this issue?
I would like to take up your offer on that. The average amount of time that people spend as refugees or in camps, if they're dispossessed people, if they're forced out of their own country, is about 10 years. So a child could go through the whole of their potential school years without ever having the chance to go to school. And yes, you're right that Syria was a country where before the civil war, before the crisis, almost every child was at school. And now it's a country which is now one of the lowest rates of school enrollment, of course, of any of the states across the region and world. And I'm thinking particularly of what you could do immediately to help refugee children. And this project in Lebanon symbolizes to me the reason why we are failing to do enough. It is not that there is not capacity to do something. It is there's not the funds and the political will to make that happen. And we've got to get a message across the world that for a very small amount of money, you could actually change the lives of 500,000 children in a country where there is the potential for them to be at a school, but there's not the money to put them there. And so we have to change the perception that people have about conditions of conflict. It is not always the case that it's impossible to provide these services because the capacity does not exist, because the breakdown of the regime is such and everything else. It is that we, the international community, have not provided the resources and don't have the political will to do it. So I would love to take up your offer. If you know of anybody that will pay for the billboards around the world, we'd be very happy to take them up. And any newspaper that wants to advertise this, we'd be very happy to help make them do this.
Maggie?
Margaret Bashir with the Voice of America. Mr. Brown, have you sought funding from the private sector and the public, and perhaps, as George mentioned, maybe through the social media campaigns? And could you talk a little bit about the importance of education in this effort to thwart radicalization of youth?
Yeah, I think the answer to your first question is yes. This has got to be, in future, a partnership between all potential funders. We are appealing to business to do what Predictive Eye, me and others are doing, and that is to be generous in making donations, because their future lies in having an educated population. We're appealing to foundations, where, of course, the premier activity has been in health, but I want to emphasize the importance, as well as health, which is clearly crucially important, of them investing in education. And we're appealing to international agencies at a time when the amount of aid spent on education has fallen by more than 10% in recent years. And this is a tragedy for 60 million children who are no longer getting support or will never get the chance to go to school. Because education aid has fallen, because some countries have stopped giving aid to basic education, because there is not enough coordination internationally of what we can do in these things, we still have this spectre that despite all the progress of the last 20 years, there are still 60 million children. We are not meeting the Millennium Development Goal. We are 60 million children short and cannot give them the chance of education. A petition has been launched in the last few weeks aimed at getting millions of children, parents and supporters of education around the world to recognise that we are far short of meeting the Millennium Development Goal in education and have got to do something about it. That petition is available on the worldatschool.org site, and it can be signed by anybody, and there are now, I believe, 5 million signatures already of this petition. It is already one of the biggest petitions ever that has been launched in the world, but the aim is to get that substantially higher by signatures from every part of the world. So the focus is on persuading people, as the previous questioner did, about the importance of education, because it unlocks your other goals of health and environmental improvement and economic opportunity, and the importance of recognizing what some people do not recognize, that there are still 60 million children denied, half of them in conflict zones, this basic right to education. Now, in schools, you've raised also the question about teaching in schools, the curriculum, the perception that in some schools people are taught that terrorist activity is acceptable. That is also something that we have got to do a great deal about. But I'm worried also about children fearful of going to school and parents fearful of sending their children to school. And we've got to do something about that as well.
Sherwin?
South African Broadcasting. Thanks, Mr. Brown, for this briefing. I'm over here. Given the appeals we've seen from you for the release of the Chibok girls, are you able to share some of your perspectives as to why, almost a year later, and given the levels of international attention we've seen focused on this issue, these girls still remain in captivity today?
You've got a very determined terrorist group whose aim is, the definition of Boko Haram is that Western education is a sin. This group does not want to see girls educated, and this group is using these girls as weapons in the campaign that they're fighting across not just Nigeria, but Chad, Niger, Cameroon, and other countries. And I think the Nigerian government has been right to emphasize that now that Boko Haram is linked up with IS and they are part of an international network of terrorist groups, that the Nigerian government needs support to fight what is an international terrorist threat that is hitting 4 countries in their region, but also linking to other countries where there is terrorist activity. There was international support, surveillance, aircraft to help rescue these girls. One of the problems is that even if you were to know where some of them are, you would put the rest of them potentially at risk if you tried to move in to get one group, but would not be able to rescue the others. And so I can't decide or give you my, I can't decide the tactics or the strategy for dealing with this. But even if you know where these girls are, it is very difficult to rescue them when they're split up into a number of different groups. It will be a year from now since on April the 14th, since the girls were kidnapped. I've talked to many of the parents of the children. I've talked to the Chibok community leaders about this. Some are fearful that their children are actually dead, and therefore they have heard stories that have been broadcast that some have been killed. We do not know if that is true or not, but you can understand a parent waking up every morning not knowing whether your child is alive or dead, not knowing whether your child has been abused or violated or what is happening to your child, not knowing if these children will ever return to you. And to talk to some of these parents is a recognition of both the dangers and risks that they have been facing and the fear that they have about the whereabouts and the safety of the children, but also the perils of a rescue operation that could go wrong. And I think you've got to bear all this in mind when you look at what's happened over the last year.
I think
Sure, thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks a lot for the briefing. Your first example were these 89 South Sudanese boys that were kidnapped. And I guess I wanted to ask you, because the UN was a little slow in reporting on it, and now it appears that they were basically kidnapped or taken by a unit that's associated with the South Sudan Army. That there's a General Aloni that's been summoned to answer on it. So I wanted to know, they're obviously, it's not a terrorist group. It's not Boko Haram. It seems to be a group that's part of an entity with which the UN, speaks. Do you think the UN has done enough in that case? And what's your understanding of the status of getting them released? And could the peacekeeping, missions in South Sudan or DRC and CAR do more to actually get child soldiers released and to ensure that education?
I appreciate what you're saying. These children apparently, from all reports we have, were seized by a warlord, and the relationship between him and the authorities and the other groups in South Sudanese is what you're speculating about. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know they were seized by a warlord. They were seized during the examinations that were taking inside the school precinct. So these 89 children are part of a new pattern of actually invading schools in this way. But in total, about 12,000 children in South Sudan have been abducted in recent times by different factions who are fighting a war and who are training these children who have been abducted as soldiers for the future. The children who were abducted from the school are only 12 to 15 years old. I said they were sitting exams. The latest information is that the terrorist group have offered to allow them to sit their exams as long as they can then take them back as child soldiers in the future. So we're dealing with a cynical, hypocritical group of people who are using these children as weapons of war. We now have 400,000 children in South Sudan who have been displaced and forced out of education. So we've got a crisis in education in South Sudan. I visited South Sudan some time ago, and then it was bad enough before the outbreak of the latest stage of the civil war. And I think we've got to recognize this, and this is why I've come to you today, that when these children were kidnapped in South Sudan, it got very little coverage in the international media. It is almost as if we've accepted that this tactic of kidnapping and abducting children from the school is something that is commonplace. And when last year the girls were abducted from Nigeria, there was a huge amount of both worry and publicity for it. This year, we're in a situation where we mustn't become accustomed to the fact that this is a practice that we can do nothing about. The whole world should be protesting, as we did over Chibok, about any child that is abducted from within the school and any child that has been kidnapped and taken into captivity, as is happening to so many children in South Sudan. Again, there's a campaign being launched in South Sudan that I've been talking to UNICEF and others about, and that is to get our children back to school. It is an attempt to persuade children and parents that they can go back to school safely, and work is being done to make the schools a lot safer. And upon that, of course, the Safe Schools initiative that has become, sadly, a necessary feature of how we plan for education for the future. Having safer schools is very much part of that, and I'm talking to people in South Sudan about how we can popularize this. The sooner the world comes to recognize that children's rights are being violated in a way that has not happened in previous years to the same extent, that we have been far too complacent as we've had a year when the violation of the rights of children has become a commonplace. And we must do something about this by raising both the profile of the international community's response to this, but these initiatives, making our schools safer, a humanitarian fund for education in emergencies, new guidelines that prevent the militarization of schools and treat them like hospitals. Now, these are the ways forward. And really, it's sad that 70 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we're having to come to a conference in New York today to talk about the basic rights of children whose rights have been neglected for too long.
Matthew?
Hi, my name is Matthew Carpenter. I'm a reporter for Yomiuri Shimbun, a Japanese newspaper.
Thank
Could
you.
you talk about psychosocial counseling and support for children who survive these terrorist attacks, or is your focus primarily on getting the kids back into school?
It's got to be both. I mean, I think anybody who knows about how children who have been the subject of violation in one way or another have got to do respond and have got to be helped, knows that what you're talking about in terms of support is necessary. But we're dealing again with an issue about resources and the resources that are available to help all the good organizations that are trying to do something in this area. So we need to first of all identify the children and get them the chance to get back into what is a near to normal life, and then we need to help them with any psychological and other problems they have.
Edie?
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
very much, Mr. Brown. You talked about this being the highest level of terror attacks on schools at any point in 40 years. Do you have some figures to back that up?
Yeah, there's a report published only a few days ago, and I can, after this press conference, get the information to you, that showed the number of attacks year by year over the last 5 years, and they've been at a record high. But also there's an international study that has been done saying that the terrorist activity against children in education is at the highest for 40 years. So I'll get the information to you.
The
We arrange that, yeah.
Is the increase mainly due to conflict or to terrorism or to both?
It's both, but I mean, if you think about the conferences you have here almost every day, when you're talking about the troubled spots in Syria, Iraq, we had the problems in Gaza a few months ago, South Sudan, Nigeria, DRC, Central African Republic, what's been happening in Pakistan, where there have been attacks on children as well as on adults. You can see that the number of conflicts that have created this new instability in different parts of the world is bound to have created more refugees and bound to have created more children whose rights are violated. But what I'm trying to draw attention to is this, that very little coverage has been given to victims of terrorist and conflicts who are young children. We talk about the general figures about refugees, we talk about people who have become asylum seekers, but when you think that young lives are either starting or are being interrupted in the primary and secondary school years by conflicts and by terrorism, it's time we focused on what has been happening to a whole generation that includes millions of children who've seen their rights violated. And one of the effects of it, I've just got to emphasize what I didn't say in my initial remarks, is in countries like Syria, in Iraq, you're seeing children being sold as sex slaves. You're seeing trafficking on a scale that is very disturbing. You're seeing children forced into child labor, and you're seeing children forced into child marriage. Now, if you look at the 60 million children in the world who are not at school, then around 10 million of these children are people who have been forced out of school and into forced compulsory marriages. 15 million children are probably children who are working as child laborers, either part-time or full-time, and not able to go to school or not able to go to much of their school activities because they are laborers, they are slaves in many respects. And we have got to wake up to the fact that in the 60s we fought this huge battle for civil rights. In the 80s we fought this huge battle against apartheid. Here in 2015 there is a civil rights struggle underway for the rights of children, whose rights have been neglected, who can easily be forced into child labor, child marriage, child trafficking, who are denied the very basic right to education, and the world has been virtually silent. And one of the reasons I'm here today is to say that this cannot go on. We cannot turn our backs on the needs of children who are the victims of war but are not listened to.
Carla?
Thank you for this briefing, Prime Minister Brown. Carla Stay, Global Research, can you elaborate on what you think might be the motivation of this attack on education in the developing world, and what will be the ultimate dumbing down of the human population? And is there any way, if you spell this out, of eliciting the support of people who are totally indifferent to this?
Well, I think this is a very important question, and as are all the questions I've been given today. I mean, some people do not believe, particularly girls, should have the right to education. And there is still a large group of people around the world, Boko Haram is one, but other terrorist groups, the Pakistan Taliban that attacked Malala in Pakistan are the same, who do not believe that girls should have this basic right to education. And that is one of the reasons why we are having to fight in 2015 for this basic civil rights struggle, that girls' education be universal and no girl should be denied her right through discrimination or prejudice. But there's a second reason, and that is we haven't taken education seriously enough. And I try, as I go around the world as UN envoy on behalf of Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General, who's desperately, as you know, committed to universal education, to remind governments that education is not a big enough priority, that they are prepared to spend on other things, but they are prepared to neglect education. And the reason that there are 60 million children who are not in school is not simply that there are groups that are trying to deny people education, but there are governments who still have not made it their priority to ensure that these children have education. And where there are conflicts and where there are humanitarian crises, it is our responsibility as an international community, because we have not done enough to make sure that the right of children in humanitarian crisis, which must include that the right to education should not be denied, is taken seriously. And that's why only 1% of humanitarian aid today is actually going to education. And education is caught between donors who want to give to traditional forms of education and don't consider that humanitarian aid or education in a crisis is an important element of that, and then the humanitarian donors who don't consider education to be a priority. So the reason that we have not done enough, and the reason that education is neglected, and the reason that aid is falling to education, which is deplorable in a world where there are so many children who are illiterate and so many girls particularly who are denied education, is not just people who oppose education, but people who have been ambivalent and unwilling to give the support to education that it needs.
Yes, in the front.
Sophie Pilgrim, France 24.
Yeah.
I noticed you didn't mention Afghanistan in the press release. Is that because that's one area that where the threat to children in schools has actually stabilized or even improved?
I don't think that's a reason. I haven't been to Afghanistan for 4 years, 5 years, and I want to visit Afghanistan. But I've talked to President Ghani about what he is trying to do. He has made it a priority of his government to improve educational opportunity. You may remember, since the Afghan invasion after the 9/11, about 6 million children have got to school. So there has been improvement. And a large amount of that improvement came with girls' education being recognized for the first time. But there are still probably 4 million children, at least in Afghanistan, who are not at school. So I haven't mentioned them because at the moment we are working with his government to try to work out a program where we can help them and persuade the international community to do more to help Afghanistan. And I would like to report back to you in a few months about what we've achieved. But we have a president who wants to do something about it. But we cannot say the problem of education or attacks on schools or the violation of girls' rights in Afghanistan is not a huge issue. It is still and remains a huge issue. Girl discrimination, the lack of facilities for education, the numbers of children who are in child labour, the early child marriages, these are still huge problems that I know the President wants to address, and therefore I will come back to you with proposals where safe schools are needed in Afghanistan, but also, again, we need to invest properly in the education of these children.
Roger?
Thanks. On Syria, obviously there's a large number of children that have been displaced who are not going to receive an education. We know Europe's given money to the region, but it's been pretty silent at home with regards to resettlement. Does Europe need to do more when it comes to resettlement so that these children can get an education?
The irony, I must keep repeating this, is that there is facilities for the education of children available in the next door country, Lebanon. And I'm not saying that Lebanon can be expected to carry any greater burden for refugees from Syria, because it already has 500,000 children and 1 million people who've come from Syria and have actually increased the population of Lebanon by 20%. So when we're looking at what can be done, surely the first thing we do is look at where we can make a huge impact quickly by providing funds that are essential so that these schools can be operating on a double shift system. We've got this amazing offer from a government that is finding it very difficult and is obviously under a lot of pressure from its own population for making this offer, that they are prepared to allow every Syrian refugee a place in their schools. And remember, the Syrian refugees are dispersed across Lebanon, so they're not in one area. And as we find in Jordan, there is not a preference for staying in camps. So they're dispersed across the whole of the country. So in each area, you could add to the school population by doing the double shift without making it impossible for the school to cope. And so here we have, and I could deal with your wider questions about the response of countries, Britain and other countries, to the demand for asylum and everything else. But I must emphasize today, here is a plan. It can be delivered. All it needs is international money and therefore the political will to do so. And we have a conference in Washington on April the 16th, which a number of countries are coming to, and we need to raise that money. But otherwise, for yet another year, the school population and 500,000 refugees will be denied the chance of education. Now, we can do this in Turkey, we can do it in Jordan as well, but we must show that something can actually succeed when there is a plan to do it in Lebanon itself.
Nizar?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Brown. Nizar Aboud of Al Mayadeen Television in Lebanon. My question is regarding what you mentioned in your earlier notes about curricula and how they contribute to the violence and this culture of violence that's spreading. It has become an international problem. What are you going to do, or what are you thinking of doing with regard to certain states who educate children on violence and fascism in a way or another, be it from Pakistan up to Nigeria or other places?
I think if I sort of graduated into discussing this today, I would divert from the main issue I want to raise with you, which is the lack of resources to deal with a real problem that exists where children's rights are being violated and abused. Now, of course, there are many discussions taking place about how we can deal with the problem of education in extremism and the difficulties that people face. But I would rather, if you may allow me to deal with that on another day. So I don't want you to lose focus on what I think is an essential problem of the violation of children's rights.
Momin al-Fasl?
Yeah, this is Mushfiqul Fazal, journalist from Bangladesh. Thank you, Ms. Prime Minister Gordon Brown. You are doing a lot to develop Bangladesh education system, as I know. Bangladesh educational system, you are doing a lot.
Yeah.
But currently these are more than 2 months, the country is under blocked and students are suffering a lot. Schools are closed. And the United Nations and the Western world, they are trying to say to the government to go for a peaceful resolution, but government is not listening anyone. So what you would say, as students are suffering a lot, these schools are closed?
Yeah, I'm not the UN envoy for conflict resolution. And there are many things that need to be done that you're suggesting is one of them, but this is not my role. Bangladesh, as you probably know, has made huge advances in education over the last 20 years. Particularly in girls' education, there have been great progress. But there are still problems about child labour and problems about child marriage and problems about the violation of children's rights in that area. So I've been working with the Bangladesh government to see what can be done. One of the areas where Bangladesh wants to make advances is the use of new technology in education, because they feel that they could actually increase the opportunities for children in remote areas and children in some of the poorest areas who could then have access, if you like, to the libraries of the world through new technology, smartphones and everything else. So we're working on that. But you're right, where there is a breakdown in a country and education is affected, we've got to see what we can do about it. But I don't want you to detract from the progress that Bangladesh has made and our desire to help them get more children into school.
We've gone on for a bit, so the last question will be you in the back, yes. No.
I've prevented you doing your briefing.
Thank you. One question on financing. It's particularly timely considering the UK's budget released today. While it should be commended for its 0.7% commitment and meeting the ODA targets, is the 0.7% ODA requirement enough to satisfy the financial goals for funding this initiative or any other initiative related to education?
Well, when I was Chancellor, and I was Chancellor of the British, in the British government for 10 years, from 1997 to 2007, before I was Prime Minister, we were determined to increase aid, which I think when we came into power was something like 0.27%, and it is now 0.7%. So it is doubled and then been raised again, and everyone who's been responsible for getting to that figure should be commended. 0.7 is a signal to the international community that we will meet agreed objectives, so that the world agreed that 0.7% was what was required in public development aid alongside private aid and everything else to finance the Millennium Development Goals and other objectives. Clearly, where countries don't meet the 0.7 objective, they are preventing this amount of aid that is needed getting to people who are in desperate and urgent requirement of it. So the first thing to do is to persuade people that the 0.7 objective is worthwhile. The second, of course, is to persuade those countries that have the resources to do so to spend more. And what's been worrying in recent years is a number of countries have reduced their aid, partly as a result of the global recession. And we've now got to persuade them to do more and bring in new donors. In time, China, Korea is now a big donor and becoming an even bigger one. And some of the Arab countries in that region are becoming donors of significance as well. So we've got to look over the piece. You've got a conference in Addis in July to look at the financing of the next stage of the Millennium Development Objectives. That conference has got to find a way of raising very substantial sums of money, including for climate change action for the future. And so we cannot accept a situation where countries move backwards from 0.7, and we cannot accept a situation where countries that can afford it, who can do more than 0.7, are in a position to offer to help in that way. And we cannot have a situation where countries that are now themselves emerging and no longer just developing countries are not encouraged to contribute to development aid in the future. And I also think in the future, public-private partnerships are going to be more important. Social impact bonds, which is another way of financing development, are going to be important. Today, there's a huge issue about energy subsidies, and as oil prices go down, huge amounts of money that is spent in energy subsidies could be transferred to invest in education, health, and anti-poverty programs in exactly the same countries. And instead of the energy subsidies benefiting primarily, or at least disproportionately, middle-income people and higher-income people in these countries, by transferring these resources, we can help the poorest. So there's a huge amount to be done, and I hope that the UK government in future, whatever colour it is going to maintain that commitment to 0.7, which, as I say, is a demonstration that we're part of an international effort in solidarity to meet commitments that will relieve the world of extreme poverty.
So
Thank you very much
like to
for your chance to speak to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Brown.
Thank you. I'll leave you to it.
Great. If you bear with me just a second. Thanks. Thank you. Great. Okay, thanks. And I'll start the spokesman's portion of the briefing. Good afternoon. I have the following statement attributable to the spokesperson for the Secretary General concerning the attack on the Bardo Museum in Tunisia. The Secretary General condemns in the strongest terms today's attack against the Bardo Museum in central Tunis and deplores the loss of life. He conveys his deepest condolences to the families of the victims of this deplorable act. The Secretary General also expresses his solidarity with the Tunisian people and the Tunisian authorities. I also have a note to correspondence that will be issued right after this, informing you that His Holiness Pope Francis will visit the United Nations headquarters on the morning of the 25th of September 2015. The Secretary General welcomes the visit of Pope Francis as an important part of a historic year in which the United Nations marks its 70th anniversary and in which member states will take major decisions about sustainable development, climate change, and the future peace and well-being of humankind. During the visit, Pope Francis will address the United Nations General Assembly. His Holiness will also have bilateral meetings with the Secretary General and the President of the General Assembly, and will participate in a town hall gathering with United Nations staff. The Secretary General is confident that His Holiness Pope Francis's visit will inspire the international community to redouble its efforts to achieve human dignity for all, through ensuring greater social justice, tolerance, and understanding among all of the world's peoples. The Secretary General is in Italy today, where he met earlier in Rome with Prime Minister Matteo Renzi. The Secretary General thanked the Prime Minister for Italy's strong support for the political and humanitarian work of the United Nations in Libya, and Italy's contribution to global efforts to address terrorism, including in Syria and Iraq. They also discussed the need to address the root causes of irregular migration and of terrorism. The Secretary General further expressed his gratitude for Italy's support to United Nations peacekeeping operations, especially in Lebanon. They also discussed the situation in Ukraine. The Secretary General also met with Italian President Sergio Mattarella, with whom he discussed Libya, Syria, migration, climate change, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Earlier in the morning, he met Italian Foreign Minister Paolo Gentiloni and spoke to the press afterwards. In his remarks, the Secretary General said that he's very concerned about the increasing presence of the so-called Islamic State, or Daesh, in Libya. He praised Italy's strong support for the UN efforts in Libya and Italy's efforts to counter violent extremism. Those remarks and the readout of his meetings are available in our office. The Secretary General is now in Turin, where he's chairing a retreat of the senior officials of the UN system. The Security Council is meeting on Haiti this morning. The special representative of the Secretary General in the country and the head of the UN mission, Sandra Honoré, said the country had made measurable gains towards the holding of long overdue elections by the end of the year. She called on all political actors to continue a genuine dialogue and a transparent and consultative approach. She also said it was time for Haitian authorities, including the Electoral Council, to demonstrate their capacity and assume even greater ownership of the electoral process. As Haiti enters a complex electoral period with a planned reduction of its military personnel, Ms. Honoré invited all partners to make an additional effort in fully staffing the police component of the mission. Her full remarks are available in our office, and she will speak to you at the stakeout after the meeting. Prior to the meeting on Haiti, the Security Council also heard a briefing from the delegation that just visited the Central African Republic, Addis Ababa, and Burundi. The Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said that due to Cyclone Pam, 11 people have died in Vanuatu, according to the government. More than 3,000 people have sought shelter in 26 evacuation centers, but people are beginning to return to their homes. Assessment missions to some of Vanuatu's worst-hit provinces have found that food, water, medical supplies, shelter, and hygiene kits are urgently needed. Communication within and between the country's islands, as well as access to affected areas, is the greatest challenge to the humanitarian operation. Nearly half of the 30,000 houses in the worst-affected parts of the country have been damaged by the cyclone. Aid agencies continue to support the government, providing help, with the UN Children's Fund having airlifted kits to cover 50,000 patients, while shelter kits and household items are being dispatched in the coming days. UNICEF and the World Health Organization are also supporting an emergency government-led vaccination drive to protect children affected by Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu. There are fears of a serious measles outbreak in the country, which already has very low rates of routine immunization and suffered an outbreak of measles, a potentially deadly disease, earlier this month. 6 teams have been deployed in the capital, with 6 additional teams expected to be trained to begin vaccinations by the end of the week. And more information is available online. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, Prince Zaid Rad Al Hussein, today expressed strong concerns about what he called the hasty and apparently unfair trial of the former president of the Maldives, Mohammed Nasheed, who has received a 13-year jail sentence. The High Commissioner said that Mr. Nasheed was sentenced following a rush process that appears to contravene the Maldives' own laws and practices and international fair trial standards in a number of respects. The High Commissioner also noted that the court refused requests by the Human Rights Commission of the Maldives, as well as domestic and international observers, to monitor the trial proceedings. There's more information on the website of the UN Human Rights Office. On Iraq, the World Food Programme announced today that it's collaborating with the government to implement a school meals program in Tikar, one of the most disadvantaged governorates in the country. The World Food Programme plans on distributing nutritious meals to 21,000 vulnerable primary school children across 73 schools in southern Iraq until the end of May 2015. There's more details in a press release from the World Food Programme. Non-smoking is becoming the new norm worldwide, according to new data presented today during the 16th World Conference on Tobacco or Health in Abu Dhabi. The new report on trends in tobacco smoking by the World Health Organization finds that in 2010, there were 3.9 billion non-smokers aged 15 years and over. That's 78% of the 5.1 billion population aged 15 and over, and this percentage is projected to rise to 81% by 2025. The World Health Organization calls on governments to intensify actions to combat the tobacco industry and dramatically reduce consumption of tobacco products. Tomorrow at 10:30 a.m., there will be a briefing here by Mustafa Jamalev, human rights activist and the leader of Crimean Tatars, and this briefing is sponsored by the Permanent Mission of Ukraine. And then at noon, I'll be joined by John Ging, the Director of Operations at the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, along with UN emergency directors from the UN Children's Fund and the UN Population Fund. And they'll be here to brief you on their recent mission to Ukraine and Nigeria. And lastly, for the honor roll, Turkey paid its dues, becoming the 61st member state to pay its contributions in full. That's it for me. Any questions? Yes, Sherwin.
Thanks, Farhan. Given the election victory of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, does the Secretary General believe that the prospects for a two-state solution and, for that matter, a peace deal are essentially dead?
Well, the Secretary General welcomes the announcement of the preliminary results of yesterday's Israeli general elections and hopes for the rapid establishment of a new government that reflects the will of all Israeli voters. It's incumbent on the new Israeli government, once formed, to create the conditions for a negotiated final peace agreement with the active engagement of the international community that will end the Israeli occupation and realize the creation of a viable Palestinian state living in peace and security alongside Israel. This includes the cessation of illegal settlement building in the occupied Palestinian territory. The Secretary General firmly believes this is also the best and only way forward for Israel to remain a democratic state. He urges the Israeli government to resume without further delay the transfer of the tax revenues it is obligated to dispense to the government of Palestine in accordance with the Paris Protocol.
You're not actually dealing with what the Prime Minister has said, that under his watch, essentially, there will be no two-state solution. What do you say to that?
We're aware of the comments that were made in the course of the electoral campaign, and you've heard what I've just had to say, which involves our expectations on the parties. Yes, Joe. Speaking to Mike. Thanks.
I wonder if you could elaborate on that one line about, I think I understood, if Israel is not committed to negotiations for a two-state solution, its democracy is in danger. It could perhaps no longer be a democratic state. What are you saying there? That
Well, to repeat, the Secretary General firmly believes that the way that we have spelled out is the best and only way forward for Israel to remain a democratic state.
only way forward. So that therefore would be an apartheid state in your view. If
I've said what I've
if
said.
they give up on
you can
two-state
interpret however
solution.
you like, but that's what I had to say on that. Yes, Iftikhar.
Thank you, Farhan. Does the Secretary General have to say anything about this 14-year-old boy who's about to be executed, a Pakistani boy who is about to be executed on murder charges in a few hours? Will he make an appeal to the government of Pakistan?
Well, certainly we have made clear, as we repeatedly do, our opposition to capital punishment. You're aware that the member states in the General Assembly passed a resolution a few years back calling for a moratorium on all executions. And of course, we have already made clear, and it's a clear concern also in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the execution of all minors. So for any number of reasons, we are opposed to the carrying out of capital punishment against anyone who is not an adult. But of course, above and beyond that, we would urge a moratorium by all states in all cases of imposing the death penalty. Yes.
Thanks, Farhan. I wanted to ask something. Yesterday, the Security Council met about 1701, and the question arose: what's the status of UNIFIL's or the UN's investigation of the Spanish peacekeeper that was killed allegedly by Israeli retaliation? But where does it stand? When will that report reach a conclusion?
Well, I believe some of the details about that particular incident were shared in the Secretary General's report on 1701. So I'd simply refer you to the language in the report on that.
Okay, and I wanted to ask, this ICSC is meeting, but I've seen a document which seems to indicate that the Secretariat has proposed and has now gained acceptance for a proposal that would involve 10% pay raises to Undersecretary Generals and, in fact, pay decreases to P1 and lower-level staff under the term of decompression, meaning making the differences between the two more extreme. And I'd like maybe now or sometime, can you explain how this would be consistent with the idea calls for reduced inequalities around the world while increasing them in this UN system?
I'm not aware whether that information is accurate, so I'll actually need to check whether that is in fact the case. I know that there's a regular dialogue that goes on between the Secretary General and the International Civil Service Commission, but whether that's one of the details, I can't actually confirm that, so I'll need to check. Yes, Mr. Faisal.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Farhan. You know, the Bangladesh, the situation of Bangladesh as you ever, and the disappearance and the people, it is increased by any means, and it is increased too much. Very recently, one of the former state minister and the spokesperson of the opposition, the law enforcement agency, they kidnapped, but his family claimed that they kidnapped by the law enforcement agency, but the government is denying. Today is 8 days crossed, but nobody knows where he is. So and everywhere it's going on. So what is your observation? What United Nations is doing anything in this regard?
Well, we've discussed this a few times in recent days, and you're aware of what Stefan and I have said about about the United Nations concerns and its efforts concerning Bangladesh. I don't have anything